Good evening. My name is Manu Bhagavan, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here to Roosevelt House for tonight's program on India's economy. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our terrific team for putting all of this together, House Director Harold Holzer and Human Rights Director Jessica Neuwirth for their support, Brianna Krumanacher for her organizational work, and all of our support, security, and sanitation staff for looking after all of us. For those of you visiting us for the first time, Roosevelt House is the former twin town home of U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, First Lady Eleanor, and Franklin's mother, Sarah, who bought the property for her son and daughter-in-law before moving in herself. The Roosevelts held many important meetings here, including with Mary McLeod Bethune, who would later head FDR's Black Cabinet, and Frances Perkins, who would go on to become the first woman cabinet secretary in the United States. Social Security was born here, and FDR held the first informal fireside chat upstairs in our parlor. The Roosevelts sold their home to Hunter College for a nominal fee in the early 1940s, and Eleanor especially maintained close ties to the school thereafter. The house eventually fell into disrepair until our last president, Jennifer Rabb, oversaw a major restoration and reopened the house in 2010 as Hunter's Public Policy Institute. Tonight's event is part of a new partnership we have with Scroll, India's preeminent digital news organization, reaching a global audience larger than any other independent outlet in the country. Scroll's indefatigable journalists have won many awards for excellence and fearlessness in coverage, including recognition from the Committee to Protect Journalists. They are now set to expand their footprint as they grow their coverage of the South Asian diaspora. Our partnership is made possible thanks especially to Samir Patil, Scroll's founder, who has put in many hours making all of this possible. Samir is here with us. Thank you, Samir. Our conversation this evening features two distinguished scholars. Ashoka Mody is the Charles and Marie Robertson Visiting Professor in International Economic Policy at Princeton University, and he has previously worked at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, among other places. Our discussion tonight is based on Professor Mody's new book, provocatively titled, India is Broken. Spanning India's history from its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, to its present one, Narendra Modi, the book argues that India's leaders have consistently made poor economic choices, each mistake feeding off previous ones to create a snowballing crisis of escalating magnitude. In essence, leaders have chosen state industry, private business, or heavy infrastructure over human capital, resulting in dramatic underinvestments in things like health, education, and equitable access to resources. Professor Mody calls this a tremendous moral failure that has resulted in a serious jobs crisis and environmental catastrophe. In real terms, all of this is reflected in a range of competing and confusing statistics. For instance, India today is the fifth largest economy in the world, after the United States, China, Germany, and Japan, and it appears set to scale this list in coming years. The news is filled with stories about new roads, urban metros, high-speed rail projects, airports, and so on, while digital superhighways are also expanding at rates to match the physical ones. Yet India remains 134 out of 193 countries on the Human Development Index, its rate of improvement in notable contrast to its overall economic position. And social indicators are even more worrisome when caste, gender, and other markers of identity are factored in. Now India, the world's largest democracy, as it likes to call itself, is preparing to go to the polls. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is running for a third term, largely on the basis of his economic track record, while the opposition calls attention to a variety of social ills and growing threats to democracy. For some, this is a moment of aspiration, while for many others, it is a moment of palpable anxiety. Does India stand at the cusp of a new horizon, or does it find itself staring into the abyss? Where exactly does India go from here? Karna Basu will join Professor Modi in conversation to help us answer these questions and to explore the many complex issues involved. Karna, my buddy, is Associate Professor of Economics here at Hunter and at the CUNY Graduate Center, and works on matters related to behavioral and developmental economics. Professors Basu and Modi will begin our program. Professor Modi has a brief presentation, and then the two of them will be in conversation for about 45 minutes. After that, we'll open the floor to questions. A reception will follow upstairs, not one floor up, but 2 floors up in our parlor room. Friends, colleagues, and students, please join me in welcoming the distinguished professors Ashoka Modi and Karna Basu.
So, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Karna. So my book, as I describe my book as a history to inform the present. But I recognize that when an audience like this gathers, they're more interested, or at least immediately interested in the present. So we are going to start backwards. I'm going to give you a very brief assessment of the present, and then in my conversation with Karna, we have agreed that we will trace the history a little bit to understand why we got here and why the title of the book, India is Broken. So you all hear the phrase, India is the fastest growing major economy in the world. That is, unfortunately, a very misleading statement, if not an incorrect statement. So what I have in front of you in this chart are the GDP growth rates during the Narendra Modi 10 years. And you see over here on the left-hand side, the growth rates have been declining. When people say that India is the fastest growing economy, they are looking essentially at the last 3 quarters. The last 3 quarters have indeed been rapidly growing, although there's a question mark even on that data. This I have not fudged the data. I've just presented the Indian statistics. The only thing I've done is I've taken averages. So what happened is that during COVID, the Indian economy fell more sharply than every other major economy. And so what is happening now is what economists call a dead cat bounce. That when an economy falls rapidly, it bounces back. And unfortunately, what people are doing is they're looking at the bounce back and claiming that this is a sign of rapid growth. No, it is not, because the average over this post-COVID period is actually lower than in the previous years. So there's been a steady decline in growth. What is more, if there was buoyancy in the economy, we would see that private investment is increasing. But in fact, the private investment to GDP ratio is declining. What is that saying? That is saying that investors are not looking very optimistically about the future. So while Indian businesses talk a good talk and talk up the Prime Minister and say great things about the economy, they are actually not investing. So the declining investment ratio is a forward-looking metric of how bullish or how bearish the investors are. The only thing that's going up is government investment. And as Manu just said, the flyovers are being built, the bridges are being built, and that's a good talking point. But as I will elaborate some more in the discussion with Karna, the United States built its interstate highway decades after it had already put all its kids in a school, primary school, high school, the GI Bill. It had achieved a measure of gender equality. My thesis in the book is that there is no country in the world, there is no exception to this rule of making progress without mass education and gender equality, or efforts at gender equality. And on those two, you can build as many flyovers as you want. They are not going to be a substitute for those basic social inequities. So why don't we just move along at this point quite quickly? Just very, very quickly, there is a problem in the data, which again the government is not willing to acknowledge. This dead cat bounce that I talked about, you can measure GDP in two ways: the income that people earn and the expenditure that people incur on the goods produced in India. There has never been such a large discrepancy in the Indian data. What this is saying is that people are earning, the income is growing at 8% a year, but expenditure is growing only at 3% a year. No one knows what the reason for this anomaly is, but if the GDP was being presented in the United States, according to US conventions, the GDP growth would have been shown to be 3%. So let's move along. Okay, so this is now the heart of my book. This is a current reflection of what my book talks about. This is data taken after I finished my book, but it is a continuation of the thesis of the book, that the singular failure of the Indian economy has been to create good jobs. In the last 5 years, from 2018 to the present, the last 5 years, and this is all government data, I have not touched the data except to present it to you. About 135 million people said that they were in the workforce. Of that 135 million, 70 million more people went to work in agriculture. I call this a catastrophic regression. An economy that is advancing, an economy that claims to be one of the world's best economies, does not rely on a heavily stressed agricultural sector for creating jobs. That such an economy, if it was truly dynamic, would be moving people out of agriculture into urban and industrial jobs. But there are very few urban and industrial jobs. You will see here that the main jobs creation outside of agriculture is in construction and in low-end services like trade and hotels and stuff like that. The manufacturing jobs, which is what powered the East Asian growth process, there are barely about 10 or 12 million jobs were created in the manufacturing sector in the last 5 years, and most of them in the informal sector. Okay, we can go ahead. This is another sign of acute stress. India has an employment guarantee system in the rural areas. This is it is a pitiful guarantee system in the sense that people are not even paid the minimum wage, and often people don't get paid even what is due to them for several months at a time. Nevertheless, the number of people who are looking for that employment guarantee because they do not have any alternative has been going up. It went up very sharply during COVID. It has come down from the COVID peaks, but on a trend line, it is still higher, much higher than what it was in 2011-12. Okay? And this is the last slide I want you to remember in particular. Why? What is the problem? The problem is that India is essentially a non-competitive, uncompetitive economy. It is unable to compete in global markets. One important achievement is that it has become competitive in high-end services. For almost 2 or 3 decades now, in software and computer related services. More recently, it's also an outpost of research and development for major international corporations. But it is a sliver. It is a sliver. Just to give you orders of magnitude, India has a population, a working age population of about 1 billion people. Of that, about 600 million are in the workforce. There are 400 million who don't even bother, who are not in the workforce and don't even bother to say they're unemployed. No one quite knows how they survive. Of the 600 who say they are in the workforce, 5 million are in those services that are expanding. So while it is an important achievement, it is very small from a national viewpoint. On the other hand, in goods, especially the blue line here is goods and goods for international markets, excluding petroleum. Petroleum exports have increased. That's the difference between the black line and the blue line. Petroleum exports have increased recently because India is importing a lot of oil from Russia after the Russian sanctions. That is being processed in Jamnagar by Mukesh Ambani and his people, and those are being exported to the rest of the world. So Indian exports of goods has increased, but goods that generate jobs have actually shown a decline in the share of manufactured goods. So things like leather goods, shoes, clothing, bicycles, stuff that in advancing, aspiring global economy begins with how East Asia made progress. On that, our share is 1.3% of the global economy. On the right-hand side, I've just drawn you a comparison with Vietnam, a country of 100 million people. And I've just taken the goods, the employment-generating goods. You can see Vietnam was much lower than India in 2011 and has now exceeded India. So this is the heart of the problem. A non-competitive economy, unable to generate good jobs, hence a heavy reliance on agriculture and on construction. Okay? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but very quickly I'll tell you that today, amongst illegal immigrants in the United States, India constitutes the third largest nationality. Again, a sign of stress. Also a rapidly growing group of illegal migrants. Yes, we can go to the next. And these are some of the people being apprehended at American borders, both in the south and the north. In the number of Indians is small, but also growing. And finally, this is somewhat more for a more technical audience. There's a financial bubble building up right now. I have some concerns that in the not so distant future, there are lots of people who are borrowing right now because there's very easy money available, and they are building up their debt levels, money being peddled through many different sources called fintechs and so on. And I'm afraid that that's not going to end happily. Okay. Yeah. These are my persistent moral failures. This is the book. If I was to talk only about the book, this is what I would talk about. Poor education quality, both in primary and secondary school. According to Eric Hanushek of Stanford University, 85% of Indian school children are functionally illiterate for a global economy. So while there is a very creamy layer at the top that is world beating, for the vast bulk, the quality of education is abysmal. Gender inequalities have persisted throughout these 75 years. The judicial system is broken. There are 50 million cases waiting to be heard in Indian courts. 50 million. Rampant environmental damage. This is our greatest moral failure in my view. We are destroying the environment. We are destroying in particular our rivers. And when rivers die, so do civilizations. And then there is a broader political degradation that's occurring that is well known to everybody. I think it's well past time that we called India a democracy. Okay, last slide. Yeah. So these are what I call the two Indias. So I want to leave you with a little smile on your face. That's the top. For those of you who know, there was a pre-wedding celebration in Jamnagar recently. This is Mukesh Ambani's son. And the superstar was apparently paid a fee of $6 million to perform at the pre-wedding bash. The airport in Jamnagar was specially designated an international airport to receive celebrities like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and various other people. That's the India that I write about. That's the India that I write about in the book, the one at the bottom. Okay, so I've given you what I believe is the present, and so we can have a chat with Karna at this point.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you to Roosevelt House and to Scroll. It's a real privilege for me to be a part of this conversation. My plan is I wanted to tell you a little more about my thoughts about the book, and then I want to talk about a few key themes in the book, and we will sort of swing a little bit back and forth between the past and the present, with some questions about the future as well. And then at some point, Manu, you can stop us and we can turn over for questions. So first of all, I think it's a really, really excellent book, and I am so glad that I read it. It's serious, it's scholarly, and it's devastating. And for those of you who are reluctant to read economics books, I would also add that it reads like a novel, like a multi-generational tragic novel. But it's very, very engaging. So, and through this, one of the things that I think you do very effectively is you show that modern economics, the framework of modern economics, is not at odds with fundamental social justice concerns. And I think one of the points that the book makes is that a failure to understand economics by policymakers is at the root of a lot of injustice that we see today. And for those of us who are in despair at the attacks on liberal values and on minorities by the current government, I think the book provides important historical context that, horrific as things might be now, it was not a paradise that the Modi government destroyed. And so it's important for us to look back and think about the past as well. And in fact, one thing I observed is that no one comes out unscathed except for the filmmaker Raj Kapoor. Yeah, and Tagore actually does well too. Yeah. So the book is very precise about language. And one of the things that it points out is that a lot of casual conversations mischaracterize both socialist and market economies. So, for example, let's talk about Nehru first. Like Nehru's supposed socialism was, as the book describes it, an obsession with planning and heavy industry and import controls to control the trade deficit. A lot of these policies inadvertently led to oligopoly and corruption. So on this, one of the points that the book makes is that Nehru could have done well to learn more from Japan's experiences with reform in the 1800s. And I thought that was very interesting. In particular, land reforms and primary education, which were both, for various reasons, not implemented well after independence. And in fact, education is a very, very big theme in the book. I think we're going to come back to it. And it reminded me of this pithy line from A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul, which always stayed with me for some reason. "This education is a hell of a thing," Ramchand said. "Any little child could pick it up, and yet the blasted thing does turn out so damn important later on." And to this, I would add one more thing. I think in this context, policymakers failed to be mindful of complementarities. Any one of these policies might have a small effect on its own, but the sum of the effects could have been huge if they had been done right. So if Nehru's socialism was not really socialism, then Modi's market economy is not really a market economy. Let me give you one example from the news. This is not from the book. So the Adani Group, Adani is one of India's biggest industrialists. They control a lot of India's airports now. They manage a lot of the airports. It turns out, so they were the highest bidders when there was a bidding process for acquisition of these rights. Turns out a lot of little things happened, which is basically the government granting market power to big firms as opposed to actually being pro-business. The government changed the laws for bidding. So they changed the law to not require prior airport experience anymore. They changed the law to eliminate the limit on the number of airports that one firm was going to be allowed to run. And then the one firm that was refusing to sell an airport, a very major airport, the Mumbai International Airport, there was a lot of coaxing, including income tax raids on their offices and so on, as ways to threaten them to give Adani a majority stake. So in that sense, neither socialism nor the best kind of market economy has been achieved, even though those terms are often thrown around. And now let me give you one example from history, because as I said, I think it's important to remember that a lot of the things that really stress us out today have their roots in the past. So the book talks at length about the administration of Indira Gandhi. And when you read it, you start to realize that a lot of stuff that happened then has parallels with the administration today. There were certain corporate political donation tricks that were implemented where you ban corporate donations, but then you end up getting them through illegal channels. There was some brilliant maneuvering to nationalize banks to have more control over lending. There was shutting down of the press, shutting down of the political opposition, co-opting the Supreme Court, slum demolitions, allowing the massacres of Sikhs to proceed extensively after Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and so on. So I think it's important to recognize that denying these things, in fact, weakens any arguments against the current administration. It's worth acknowledging that this was a low point in Indian democracy, but perhaps no longer the lowest. So now let's have a conversation about some of the themes from your book. So the first one I want to talk about is jobs. And on each of these, there's a couple of questions I'm going to throw at you, and I think you can take it wherever you want. So there was a recent interview by an advisor to the Indian, a member of the Economic Council, Shamika Ravi, on job. And one of the things she talked about was jobs. And she said, it's very evident from the data that wealth creation or economic growth is leading to job creation. And when pressed on inequality, she had a number of arguments. She said youth inequality is high because a lot of the youth are now willing to wait for the better jobs they'll get when they're a little older. Another point she made is that a large part of the unemployment is among the educated because they now want the right jobs. And in fact, the Prime Minister Modi tweeted recently where he said, he tweeted to people who failed the civil services examination recently. And he said, setbacks can be tough, but remember, this isn't the end of your journey. There are chances ahead to succeed in exams, but beyond that, India is rich with opportunities where your talents can truly shine. So, okay, so I have a couple of questions for you. One of the things that your book really focuses on is missing jobs as opposed to unemployment. And that's a very important point, and you alluded to that a few minutes ago as well, which is that unemployment is not a good measure of the work that's needed because there's a lot of people who are just simply out of the labor force, especially the huge reduction in female labor force participation that you mentioned. And then the second question is, why, if, okay, so why the focus on missing jobs, and why not instead spend more time thinking about things like universal basic income? You do talk a little bit about that, and I understand that there's huge potential implementation problems, and I wonder if you anticipate other issues associated with that as well. They said to just leave it all.
So let me start with the job situation. So one of the strengths of the Indian economy is said to be something called the demographic dividend. The demographic dividend is the idea that populations that are relatively young have an opportunity to grow rapidly because the young come into the workforce, the young save and invest, and it is a well-documented feature, especially in East Asia, that during the phase of this demographic growth, where the young are a significant portion of the population, there is a relatively rapid growth. And so when the Indian economy, the Indian population exceeded 1.4 billion earlier, sometime in June of last year, there was the usual flurry of applause, which said India is now poised to exploit this demographic dividend. The difficulty with that statement is that India has had a demographic dividend for 75 years. Even in Nehru's period, there was a relatively young population. So our common friend Ajit Ghosh has documented this very ably. There was a large demographic dividend, but India could never exploit that demographic dividend. The problem started, as in most cases, with Jawaharlal Nehru. Let me be clear that I think well of Jawaharlal Nehru as a human being, and he held important virtues. He was tolerant. He was secular. He aspired to greater equality amongst Indians, but his policy making, quite simply, was terrible. And the focus on heavy industry during that period essentially not just killed jobs in the early phase, but it set us on a trajectory where we never really caught up. So the problem that Karna is referring to, what he calls the missing, is again a theme that Ajit Ghosh talks about, is that in India you cannot afford to be unemployed. So therefore, most people are not unemployed. They work on farms, and the missing is in the sense that they work maybe half the time, half the year, and the other half of the year they have nothing to do. Or if they come to the cities, they work in these mom and pop stores where they are working maybe 3 or 4 hours in a day. So it is this vast underemployment, or what economists call surplus labor that is potentially available for work, but doesn't have the opportunity for work. At this point in time, of the 600 million people in the Indian workforce, maybe something of the order of 200 million people or 150 million people are vastly underemployed. So when people talk about unemployment rates, it's not a very useful and interesting statistic for India, because people cannot afford to be unemployed, so they just are underemployed. For those of you who know a little Hindi, if you don't mind, I'll just transgress and give you a Hindi anecdote. Some years ago at a community center in Delhi, I asked my gym instructor, तुम दिन में क्या करते हो? What do you do during the day? And he said, मैं time pass करता हूँ. So in the Hindi lexicon, you do not pass your time, you do time pass. Doing time pass is part of a sense of activity. It has become a cultural and linguistic phenomenon because it is so common, especially amongst the young. So that is the phenomenon. It has a very tragic consequence. There are millions of young kids who are in third and second rate and third rate colleges all over the northern belt of India, who are doing time pass by doing multiple degrees because they fear going out into the world, or they're looking for these civil service exams because there are so few private sector jobs. Everyone's goal is to get a government job. Because once you get a government job, there is some sense of sinecure over there associated with it. There's some benefits. And so people will try for these civil service jobs a zillion times. They will try for jobs like that of a bus conductor, or one very attractive job these days is to be in the police. Being in the police has many advantages besides being a government job. It also gives you rights to various other means of earning incomes. So, for example, if you there is a perpetual sense that people pay to get the question papers for the police service exam. And they pay vast sums. So I asked my father's driver once, why do people pay these large amounts to get the benefit of seeing the exam paper well before the others do? And he looked at me and said, you look like a smart guy. Don't you know? He says, he's going to earn this back in 3 years. So it creates a number of pathologies. People are unemployed, they're disgruntled, they're trying to get this lottery which will lead them to some kind of a government-related job. And it is basically corroding an entire generation, which I fear is not going to necessarily end well. On Shamika Ravi's point, what can I say? There are two things going on in this Modi government. Either they are cherry-picking the data and telling you things are doing very well, like GDP is growing rapidly. GDP is growing rapidly, as I just pointed out, because of this dead cat bounce, and even that seems to be very hokey. Or they are casting a fog on the data, such as it exists. I've just shown you the statistics on the periodic labor force data that everybody uses. It's very straightforward there. In the last 5 years, 70 million more people in agriculture. To me, that is a sufficient statistic. I just need that one statistic to tell me the state of the job market. If there were jobs, you would not be creating, you would be taking people out of agriculture, not pushing them back in there. Did I miss something?
Well, if you had any thoughts on the feasibility of universal basic income.
Oh, universal basic income. No, I'm a proponent of universal basic income, and all I can say is I reflect a view that Professor Bardhan at Berkeley has expressed, that this is something desirable. In terms of feasibility, it's not a budgetary problem, it's a political problem. I mean, as Professor Bardhan rightly points out, there is a lot of garbage in the budget. But the problem with that garbage in the budget is there are silos of entitlements. And as in any budget, breaking those silos of entitlements is virtually impossible. So there are farm subsidies, there are food subsidies, there are all kinds of subsidies, and unless you dismantle those subsidies, there is no space in the budget. So it's a sort of, it's a kind of a catch-22, that you say, you create these silos and then you say there's no space. But yes, no, in a better world, there would be more space in the budget. The budgetary issue is actually an even more serious one, because people will say, well, there's no space in the budget for health and education. Yeah, but you're wasting the money on all the other things. Why is that a priority? So budget becomes an excuse for all kinds of problems.
Thanks. That was great. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about poverty and inequality. So by some measures, I mean, India, like over the last several decades, like by a lot of measures, there have been reductions in poverty. And what's interesting is that a lot, like you can think about poverty either just in terms of incomes, consumption or expenditures, but you can also think of like broader measures like multidimensional poverty measures. And one of the things that the government has touted is a very big drop in multidimensional poverty over the last decade. So there have been some questions about the fact that they reweighted and they added some factors that would be favorable to them and so on. But still, there probably has been a reduction. One of the things that you point out, and I think that's important, is that our measure of poverty in general, just to think in terms of consumption or income, it's very sensitive to the choice of poverty line. So by thinking of the poverty line as $190 a day or $215 a day in dollar purchasing power terms, there have been big drops. But if you set the poverty line at $3.20 a day, which you use in the book to describe people as the precariously poor, the people who are just below that line, the numbers of Indians today who continue to be below that line, it's quite staggering. So then, that is connected probably to the question of inequality, because there's sometimes there might be an attempt to brush inequality under the rug if there were bigger reductions in poverty. But with inequality, so there was a big report by the World Inequality Lab that came out recently that studied the data quite carefully and showed that India's top 1% earns 23% of the income and has 40% of the wealth. So these are huge numbers, and it's like it makes India one of the most unequal countries in the world. So in this context, what do you say to that very standard counter-argument to this emphasis on inequality, which is that inequality is an inevitable, or maybe not inevitable, but only a temporary phase in the process of development?
Okay, so that's a very important question, and I will say two things, Karna. One is, that's wrong, and the second is it's wrong in both respects. So if you look at the East Asian experience, by East Asia I mean the successful East Asian economies, Taiwan, Korea, Japan before that, China. During their most intense and heartwarming phase of growth, they achieved both growth and equality at the same time. The inequality decreased and growth increased in the critical phase of development. And it's not a mystery why. It's not a mystery why, because they were educating their kids. Education is the great equalizer. Everywhere in the world, the historical experience on this is without exception, education has this great paradox that it is on the one hand the great equalizer if you have access to education. On the other hand, it is a diabolically dangerous unequalizer if the access is poor. So what the East Asians did was they created this enormous access to education. One of the things people forget is that Mao's China, for all the problems it had, it educated its kids. When China came out of its communist period in 1981 or thereabouts, the first World Bank report on China by a group of hardened World Bank staff, their jaws fell. If you read the report, it's like their eyes are popping out. They said, this country has educated its kids. This country has good public health. That is the essence of development. And if you do it that way, if you do development that way, then inequality and growth are not a trade-off. To the contrary, inequality becomes an impediment to growth. For example, today, what is the problem with Indian education? Most rich kids are going to very elite schools, and from there to American and British universities. Just to give you one example, the well-known British school Harrow has recently apparently made some efforts to set up a branch in India. And they charge something in the range of $20,000 a year. And so somebody who was doing an interview asked a potential mother who was going to send a kid to that school, that's a lot of money. And she said, yes, but my alternative is to send him to England, to Harrow in England. So those are the alternatives the rich people are looking at. They are no longer doing the school leaving certificates that India offers, but they are doing the international baccalaureate and so on, because their goal is to go to American universities. Why is that interesting for this audience? Because it means that they have decided they don't care about the garbage education that 85% of Indians are getting. Inequality creates a phenomenon that I call exit. The rich have exited any commitment to public goods, any commitment to a sense of common destiny. Because during the COVID period, for example, while there were shortages of oxygen supply in Delhi, rich Indians were going to Dubai and to the UK and even to New York because they could afford to. There was a moment in the COVID period when countries were beginning to place barriers on the entry of foreigners. Chartered flights costing tens of thousands of dollars were going from India to these destinations because of how horrible things were in India. These anecdotes all tell the same story, that when there is inequality, the public good provision in the country has no champions. And the lack of champions then further deepens the inequality, because there is no interest in investment in education. I mean, just to complete this one line of thought, India is today building bridges and flyovers and the digital highway. Put aside the digital highway for a second. Why the priority on highways and flyovers and bridges rather than on mass education. Or on public health. Because construction is where the money is. There's these large construction contracts, no one quite knows how to cost them. And the other, at the other end, on education, as Karna very astutely noted, education is not just about sending your kid to school. Education is about learning. Today, almost 100% of Indian kids are enrolled in schools. That's true worldwide. Today, the challenge is no longer enrollment. Today, the challenge is to teach them arithmetic, to teach them reading. And that, in turn, it's interesting that an urban scholar named Jane Jacobs once first pointed this out, this complementarity. She says, you need good neighborhoods. You need good health. You need good nutrition. You need to have a family that is nurturing. Education is an educational system depends on millions of unsung heroes. Education does not depend on somebody building a bridge and coming to inaugurate it. The visibility and the symbolic virtues of bridges and flyovers makes them politically attractive. But creating an educational system which may require 2 decades does not have any immediate political winners. So for all these reasons, education, health get low priority, whereas the other stuff gets much higher priority.
Thanks. I think that settles it. So I have a lot of things I want to chat with you about, but I think we're going to get cut off for Q&A quite soon. Okay, let's do 2 more things. One running theme in the book is morality. In fact, at one point you described the economy as a moral universe. And you had one, I thought very disturbing quote from the book by Snigdha Poonam, where she said during her, when she was traveling around while working on a book, speaking to a lot of young Indians, she said, few young Indians I met had a clear sense of right and wrong. Fewer gave a damn about it. And I think this point also interacts with another major theme of yours, which is the environment. And I think there's a connection between being indifferent to one's neighbors and being indifferent to future generations. And one of the solutions you propose to this moral disarray is a personal morality among politicians that you argue is important. But my question is, how does an electorate enforce that? Yeah. Or how does it even ask for that, which is, I think, an important question, especially for the elections that start tomorrow?
So let me answer in 2 parts on why morality is important, and then what are the potential pathways of achieving public morality. Somewhat to my surprise, recently I was invited by The Economist to do an op-ed for them. So you cannot pitch an op-ed to The Economist. It's by invitation. And so they thought that I will write a piece on economics, and my second paragraph said, the problem in India is a lack of public morality. And so they were very taken aback. They said, well, we thought you were going to write about regulations and tax cuts and stuff like that. Where does this public morality stuff come in? To their credit, they let me rewrite it to expand on that, and so the piece did come out. And my major point there was that public morality reflects a view of what is important, of what the priorities of society should be. What constitutes a priority that leads to a collective sense of achievement and public progress. As distinct from a narrowly selfish viewpoint. Kaushik is here. He will be better able to tell you this is very much part of an Adam Smith view of the foundations of moral economics. Theory of Moral Foundations talks about this at great length, but I submit that even The Wealth of Nations, which is this classic text, a book which propagates the idea of self-interest as the dominating motor of economics, is very imbued with this notion of equality and moral purpose. That tells you what you are going to do. Are you going to invest in education? Are you going to make greater efforts at gender equality? And in a modern sense, are you going to protect the environment? Because as he quite rightly said, one part of the morality is your neighbor, and the other part of your morality is your children. The breakdown of morality is occurring in both directions, in both dimensions. How you deal with it, you have to go back in an odd way to the early 19th century in the United States. This is the America that first de Tocqueville described, and then the America that even in the first half of the 20th century, Robert Putnam described. This is a vision of society that's based on communities, where there is a sense of community purpose. And the basic thesis is that where there are civic organizations, those civic organizations create a culture of caring about others. And then from that civic organizations emerge is a local government. And that local government then is constrained not by restraints imposed on them, but by a sense that we are in this together. And you see examples of that even in the Indian context. The state of Kerala has a much greater sense of civic purpose, and that's also where the education and public health are at its best developed. If the standards of education and public health in the rest of the country match that of Kerala, and we would be a developed nation by now. But it's grounded in an essential civic engagement, from which then emerges a public morality. So that's my sort of two-part response. Why it's important, and the only way, unfortunately, to do it is through this ground level, for which reason it doesn't happen overnight. So it's not going to do very much for this election.
So that's a good segue to the last thing, which is like thinking briefly about the future. You do, like, I think in the context of morality and in the context of a lot of other things, I think you talk about how one thing that may be needed is decentralization. And that local governments might be better positioned to be better stewards. But there's two concerns I have in regards to that. One is a lot of the successes of East Asian economies that you describe, and you've been very clear about the many ways in which they achieved things India didn't. They did not come out of decentralization. And given that India is not anticipating any decentralization anytime soon, are there any silver linings for the next administration, which is probably going to be another Modi administration? So
let me first agree with you. that if I look at Taiwan and Korea, decentralization was not, as I understand the history, a central part of their achievements. Taiwan and Korea present a very important paradox in development thinking. They were authoritarian regimes that had a sense of common purpose. Their investments in education and public health are what you would expect a more enlightened regime to implement. Why that happened is something that people will debate for a long time. The one exception, though, is China. China had a very important decentralization. So, particularly in the post-Mao period, decentralization has played a very important role in the Chinese context. That said, that because it is a process that takes so long, its image and because the political forces that militate against decentralization in India are so strong. Just to give you one example, the state of Maharashtra, many of you know, is one of India's most industrially advanced state. It does not have a single elected municipal government right now. They simply don't hold the elections there. Why? And I feel sorry to say this. They don't do so because then the state government can appoint its own officials as mayors and stewards of these states. And these guys make so much money through this process. I mean, for example, the city of Mumbai has a budget that is larger than that of many states. But it does not have an elected government. I mean, it would be like if the New York City or Los Angeles refused to were administered mainly from their capital cities. So, rather than going in the direction of decentralization, we, if anything, are going in the opposite direction. What does this mean for the future? This is where, I end the book. So, where I end the book is to say that the only hope is decentralization. And while I acknowledge that that is hard, if we don't have that, the future does not look good to me. That is why I end with such a bleak outlook, because what this means is that the sense of me is so dominant right now, both in social, in corporate, in political life. Everywhere, there is a sense of how do I get ahead. So, to give you a quote from Robert Putnam, a well-known political scientist at Harvard, we have reached a point where, as he says, the mantra has become do unto others before they do unto you. And as Partha Dasgupta, another eminent scholar at Cambridge University, says, when you expect the others are going to cheat, it is optimal for you to cheat. And so the society has become of a nature where immediate short-term gains infuse every part of the social fabric. And as a result, yeah, it's possible that GDP growth will remain high for a while. But that's why early in the book I say, I don't focus on GDP growth. The only reason I presented those numbers to you today is because you hear so much about it, and I did not want you to go away feeling that I did not address that issue. That's why I look at jobs, and I look at education, and I look at things that I believe are close to the lived reality of people. And that is where I continue to think that the current way of doing things or more of the same is not going to work.
Thank you very much. I think we should end there and then turn it over to Manu, who will take over.
Thank you very much. Very good questions.
First, let me just thank Professors Modi and Basu for a amazing, eye-opening, detailed conversation. I think the biggest thing we can all agree on, to economists, with a lot of difficult data to present, you just made it so understandable to everyone in the room. So it was just great. Thank you so much. So what we'd like to do now is open the floor to questions. And what I mean by this is questions. So I'm going to ask you to keep your remarks brief, and what we'd like to do, I think, is collect maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then we'll turn it over. So we have mics. If I can see a show of hands of people who'd like to ask questions, and then we'll move around. We'll start in the back there, please.
Hi. I'd just like to thank you first for the enlightening conversation. It's incredibly important to me. I kind of want to move to something that resonated with me particularly, which was education, as an 11th grader at Hunter College High School myself. And I wanted to just ask, when we're thinking about these investments in human capital and how that results in failures in India's economy, to what extent do you see private education as a possibility or a way for India to achieve better outcomes for its future generations? And to what extent is public education better than private education? And kind of adding on to that, how does political factors like, for example, India's, like the Hindu rewritings of some of India's textbooks in public education factor into that decision between public versus private education?
Okay, thank you. So we're going to take 2 or 3, and then we'll turn it over. Salil in the back, and then I've got one on this side.
Thank you. I just started reading the book, and it's terrific. Thank you for writing the book. Question is about Nehru, because you started talking about him, and you sounded critical about him, and that's why. Did he have a choice? 1947, Cold War about to start, the US very clearly inclined in a way, the security umbrella coming for East Asia, which gives them the open markets in return for security coverage. India has no choice but to follow the other model, which is the heavy industry, and which is the one where the state has to play commanding heights. I know the background of the word, of the society. Did he really have a choice? Or are we blaming Nehru for the sins of Indira Gandhi?
Okay, thank you. And I saw a hand over here. Yes.
I have 2 very brief questions, economic questions.
Hang on for the mic, please.
2 very brief economic questions. One is, do you foresee in the next few years a collapse of the government's finances as happened in Ireland and Greece and some other countries at the end of the 2008 financial crisis, seeing that they are mostly taxes and borrowings and not much private capital formation, as you wrote about? And secondly, the IMF wrote a report on the 18th of December talking about how the Indian government is manipulating the price of the value of the Indian rupee, that they had sold $72 billion to buy up the rupee, which is junk. So do you see after the elections at some point in time the value of the rupee going down substantially and its consequences for India's balance of trade and stuff like that? How will that play out?
I'm going to start at the end because these are more technical questions which are easier to answer. On the finances of the government's finances, I'm not yet worried that there will be a fundamental collapse. I'll just give you one basic reason, and then there are more refined ones which I can talk about separately to you. The government has access to vast sums through the nationalized banks and through what economists call financial repression. And it does not really rely very much on international money like the Irish and the Greeks did. So I don't, even though the debt to GDP level is going up, I don't think I'm alarmed on the government's debt side. I'm more alarmed on the private debt that's accumulating, which, although lower, is being accumulated by people who can ill afford that debt. On the currency, both in the book and in my subsequent writings, I've been very clear that India's currency is grossly overvalued, that the rupee should be closer to 100 if India wants to export. Right now, Indian exports are stymied by two factors. One are the structural factors I talked about, poor functional literacy, weak gender equality, and on the macroeconomic side, the currency is too expensive. If the currency was closer to 100 rupees, then India would have something of a fighting chance. Unfortunately, Indians have developed this notion that a strong currency is a metric of the strength of the economy. That is true if the economy is really strong, but if the economy is weak, then a weaker currency is necessary to get out of that slump. And that's partly why you see the export performance, especially on the goods side, so weak. On Nehru, so I had planned initially to start the story with Mrs. Gandhi. But then I realized that Mrs. Gandhi inherited a system from Jawaharlal Nehru. And what she inherited was a very weak educational system. Now, just to be clear, I'm also a product of an IIT. So is my wife. So I have benefited from the system. But for everyone like me who went to an IIT, there are thousands who did not get primary education. That process begins with Nehru. So, either Kaushik or Karna mentioned that I have a long discussion of Tagore. And that chapter on education I called Tagore's Unsung Song. There was no earthly reason to not invest in primary education. And it must remain a mystery why somebody like Nehru, who was a genuinely important historian, who understood how education had played such a fundamental role in the development process, why did that become low priority? It was low priority for 17 years. There was no point in time where there was even a moment of rethinking about it. That's number one. Number two, to his credit, he tried to deal with the Hindu Code Bill and so on to create somewhat greater gender equality. But this is where Nehru's second problem arises, and this is one of his important biographers, as Gopal mentions. Nehru was very good at conceiving ideas, but extremely poor at implementing them. So the phrase the Times of India used was, he has his head in the clouds. The Hindu Code Bill did come through a tortured process through the 50s. But then the implementation of that process was very weak. The third was what Karna also made reference to, a rampant corruption that grew during his period. The corruption grew on steroids during Mrs. Gandhi's period. But she inherited a corrupt system. You see, the point about broken norms is that when norms are broken, it becomes easier to break more norms because you don't stand out for having broken those norms. And so, 1964, before Jawaharlal Nehru died, there was the Santanam Committee report, which is discussed extensively in Gunnar Myrdal's Asian drama. It was a very corrupt system, and it was not just corrupt in the so-called permit license Raj that everyone likes to talk about. It was all these contracts, construction contracts, public works contracts. The Santanam Committee very gingerly says, we fear that corruption has entered the judicial system. Those are Nehru's sort of more grievous moral failures. Even the construction of dams, people like Miraben were telling him, be careful, you don't play with nature in this manner. On the heavy industry, which is where your question was posited quite rightly, I refuse to accept that there was a constraint. It's not very well known, but Milton Friedman visited India in 1955. He was invited by C.D. Deshmukh. He was not part of the group that assembled in Calcutta with Mahalanobis and company. He was kept out of that process. Milton Friedman in 1955 said, this odd combination of heavy industry for commanding heights and then cottage industry for employment, he says, this is madness. He said, what you need are the kinds of firms, he did not use this expression, but he came close to companies in the neighborhood of Osaka and its environments, 100 people, 50 people, producing relatively low quality products, but beginning to engage in a learning process, such that manufacturing would then become a much bigger part of the Indian culture. But it remained a sort of isolated thing. So even today, so we talk about the so-called Gujarat model of growth. The Gujarat model is Nehru's heavy industrialization, except that it has a different name now. Gujarat model achieves high GDP growth. Why? Because if Mukesh Ambani and others invest in petrochemicals, you see that in GDP growth. Where are the jobs? Why does India today want to construct semiconductor plants? For heaven's sake, we cannot export garments to the level of Bangladesh. So that culture that got set in, where the Indian entrepreneurs sort of basically exited from mass manufacturing to a very sort of specialized manufacturing, we never really got over it. On private education, look, there are a lot of people today in India who think private education is the solution. I am now just speaking from my understanding of the history of successful nations. I have not seen an example of that. Literally not. Education is a public commitment. I tell my Indian friends, I live in Princeton. For those of you who are from New Jersey, you know the property taxes there are very high. My children have long since graduated from school. I don't for a moment ask myself, why am I paying property taxes? You have a home that is comparable in value to my house in Princeton. The property tax in Shanti Vihar, for example, will be 1/100th or 1,000th of the property tax I pay. We are privatizing schooling because we are unwilling to make a social commitment to our kids. We are not privatizing because privatization is cheaper. The great difficulty with private education is its expense. You know, they talk about cheap private schools and so on. I don't believe in that mythology. You have good schools or you have bad schools. But you need to have a public commitment to education. Otherwise, you're not going to educate your kids.
Okay, thank you. We are actually at close to the clock here. So, but I'm going to allow one more question and a brief answer. That was the first hand I saw. Yeah.
Why so many famous people went to Albania?
Hang on. I'm sorry. Use the mic, please.
Well, if situation like so complicated, India is very bad and so on, why so many famous people, world-famous people, went to Ambani wedding for food, entertainment, connection? What's the reason of this?
That's a very nice question. The question for those of you who might not have heard it, why did Bill Gates and Ivanka Trump and Mark Zuckerberg go for the Ambani wedding? Pre-wedding, okay, pre-wedding. I wish I knew the answer to that. That is a question I've asked many people myself. I mean, why exactly does Bill Gates feel that he needs to put on a fancy dress and appear in Jamnagar in a private jet, a man who claims to have these great social ideals? It's a great mystery to me. It's a good question.
Okay, well, on that note, we have festivities of our own. They are not as good as the Ambanis, unfortunately. But first of all, just a couple things. There's going to be a book signing on the first floor, which is the entry-level floor. Professor Modi will be there. You can pick up a book. He's going to sign on the, sorry, she's gone. She's going to sign on the first floor. Well, we'll figure it out, but the books are available on the first floor. The reception is on the second floor in the fireside chat parlor. So when you can take the elevator or you walk up 2 flights of stairs. Before you all leave, can you just join me in thanking our amazing panelists?